So series, it's cybersecurity headlines.
The White House seeks more power over rogue drones and quantum computing. Decades old bugs discovered in antivirus software, and the CDC purchased phone location data during the pandemic. These are some of the stories that my colleagues and I have been bringing to you on this week's cybersecurity headlines. And now we get a chance for some insight, some opinion, and most definitely some expertise on these stories and more from our guest, Sean Bowen, the CISO at World Fuel Services. Sean, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. I love being on.
Great to have you back. And of course, we want to thank our sponsor before we get into the show proper. Our sponsor, Census, take the guesswork out of your attack surface. Of course, you can join us on LinkedIn Live. How to do so? Just go to CISOseries.com, look for the weekend review page, and you can find the link. I won't wait for you to do that, though, because we've got about 20 minutes. So let's jump right into it. Our first story here, India gives organizations 6 hours to report cyber incidents. India's Computer Emergency Response Team has set up a veritable panoply of requirements for cyber-related organizations, including requiring service providers, corporations, and government entities to report cybercrime incidents within 6 hours of detection, requiring virtual asset and wallet providers to maintain KYC records for 5 years, requiring service providers to maintain 180 days worth of system logs, and requiring cloud and VPN providers to register validated names, emails, and IP addresses of subscribers. You know, Sean, there's a whole lot of requiring that probably have a lot to do with high profile breaches in India as of late coming here. The 6 hour requirement sounds like, will require some diligent practice, as do the record keeping requirements. Demanding VPN and cloud subscriber data, though, is that going too far, or is this just going to be standard practice for governments going forward?
Yeah, I think it'll be standard practice. I think the 6 hours is always difficult as well. I think it's one of those things. When do you determine that it was an incident before it was an event, right? We always have that problem in the traditional SOC perspective of, so when does that 6 hours start counting? And so I think that's going to be some of those loopholes that need to be locked down a little bit better. But also, I think the type of data, the connections, I think what they're really trying to go after, which I think is a good thing, is containing the blast radius for an incident. And so the request might seem overreaching, but it's not unreasonable. It's just how well do you have that document? How well can you actually provide that? And that's some of the issues I have with the way any of the governments are going to cyber incident reporting is they're not requiring something to be done. They're requiring you to report on something. And so it has a secondary effect of, well, that means you have to be able to provide it. But there's no clear way on how to do that. So I think that's where a lot of these problems will stem in the future, because there's no clear way.
Do you think there's any danger, or I guess any concern over having such a strict requirement leading to false positives? As to your point, we're not sure this is an incident, but we need to report it so we stay ahead of compliance.
Yeah,
Like, do you see
absolutely.
that? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a lot of problems. You'll get a little bit of not necessarily boy you cried wolf, but more alert fatigue, right? We did a super cyber Friday on that in September about alert fatigue, and so this is just going to be reporting fatigue, where people are going to over report. I think that depends on the cultures. The different countries in the world will all have that slightly different based off of the type of environment that they're in.
All right, well, moving on. The White House wants more power to crack down on rogue drones. The White House wants to give its agencies more power to respond to nefarious drones that pose risks to public safety, privacy, and homeland security by expanding the use of technologies that can identify and neutralize them, such as things like RF jammers. The power would also apply to state and local authorities that must currently request assistance from federal authorities to respond to drone threats. Aside from the whole nefarious drones being, I don't know, a great band name, do you see this as a proactive move by government to keep up with the times? And I guess the question is, how do you determine nefarious activity? I guess you could have like a white list of behaviors to kind of work off of, but it seems a little ambiguous.
Yeah, well, I think one of the most well-maintained environments is our airspace. I think with the FAA rules on traditional flights, a lot of people that watch this all know at some point I have to bring up skydiving. Like, that's my hobby. Like, the rules around that are very strict, and we have to follow certain guidelines. and people getting their private pilot's license have similar guidelines, and commercial pilot's license, et cetera. And so we've taken something that was well regulated and we've thrown the chaos of Joe consumer flying whatever thing that they can buy. And so I think there's some fairly simple rules, no flyer, but we have just a preponderance of new pilots, if you know, drone pilots, but new pilots entering the airspace that didn't necessarily have the same level of education, that a private pilot does, to learn about no-fly zones and bad flight habits and directions and things like that, and how to handle situations in airspace. So it's definitely causing some problems. I worked at a location that had the employee that put the drone on the White House 6 years ago or so. So I've seen what happens to those types of things, and so it's difficult to regulate some of that just by purely you have to go get a license to get a drone when you could just go to Walmart and buy one. So there's got to be some way for them to counter that. But to your point, I think that there is how do you define nefarious? Is it other than breaking flight rules? But then you're still not punishing the people, and there's not lessons, and so there's got to be education in the right direction. You can't just smack everyone's hand. I think there's got to be a balanced approach, but I don't think that this is unreasonable.
All right, our next story, Solana Network goes dark after bot swarm. A swarm of bots hit the popular NFT minting tool called Candy Machine over the weekend, hitting it with 4 million transaction requests and 100 gigabits of data per second, ultimately pushing validators of the blockchain out of consensus. The network went dark for roughly 7 hours as a result, only coming back online after restarting the validators in an effective hard fork. This is really interesting in terms of the mechanics of the blockchain. The idea that its validators can be pushed out of consensus seems like, I don't know, like a mutant variable that blockchain was supposed to be all about avoiding. I'm curious, Sean, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, so a little bit different than this, but this goes back to regulation, and I'm not trying to advocate for regulation on every possible thing, but that's kind of the concern that everyone's had 5-6 years ago with regards to cryptocurrency, right? How do we validate that this is a good investment, that I'm going to put my money in it, that we're going to do transactions? And so far, it's basically been on the trust of the people designing it, and we know how many software vulnerabilities we have coming out every week. And so now you're having to design on something like this with no real validation or regulation that they can withstand a denial of service attack or an integrity attack that could severely compromise. Because this goes dark. What if this compromise actually modified the entire chain that allowed the integrity of this to switch out so you can't trust any of the NFT pieces? And so that's where there's back to kind of the drone thing, right? Everyone's doing this. Who doesn't have an NFT minting or a cryptocurrency nowadays, right? Who doesn't have anything in the block using blockchain in some way and somehow? And so the barrier of entry is so low that we're having problems with the quality of it. And this is concerning, but I think it's also a good. It was a non-punishable, incident, like a reminder. Like, not a lot of people suffered a loss. There wasn't millions of dollars lost by Joe citizen. So I think it's kind of that right balance of, ooh, hey, maybe I should pay attention.
Yeah, as opposed to the Ronin Bridge attack, which was to the tune of 600 million. So
Exactly.
definitely the year of painful crypto lessons, perhaps,
Yeah.
as the industry matures, for sure. And next up here, DOD fished for $23.5 million. The U.S. Department of Justice convicted California resident Serkan Oyuntur of multiple counts related to phishing activities against the Defense Department. In September 2018, Oyuntur registered a domain with a spelling very similar to a legitimate domain commonly used by DoD contractors. He used this domain to dupe some of DoD's civilians to divert payment, to his own bank account to the tune of $23 million. In terms of overall, DoD spending, that dollar amount may be small, but, this is another example of someone using a pretty low tech approach to successfully penetrate or at least gain access to Department of Defense funds. Does this give you any concern, Sean, for overall safety of DoD process, or are there sufficient partitions and bulkheads in place to kind of confine this activity?
No real concern from the DoD perspective, and that's coming from decades of DoD experience. Because if you really start to read in this, I think there's a little bit of headline gotcha headline type thing in here. DoD necessarily wasn't phished. They paid the account that was appropriately logged into their system. The problem was the supplier, the fuel supplier, was phished successfully, and they used their credentials to log in and change the account number, which happens quite a bit. I've had several companies, several customers of ours, where someone does a typo squat registration of a domain close to our name, sends an email to one of our customers and says, "Hey, we updated our account information. Please pay here." And that's kind of similar to what happened here. It wasn't that direct, that traditional BEC kind of attack, or typo squat attack. It was they set them up with a fake website, and then when they logged into it, they were able to harvest those credentials and then go to the real website, kind of pseudo manual man in the middle attack. But then went into the real site and then changed their account name or account numbers. And so those are going to happen, and that's the education of your customers. I think that's something we are all used to in a bank. So you get a text message or an email every once in a while that says, "Remember, our bank won't ask for your social security number," or whatever. These types of things. There's going to be, hopefully there's no regulation in this, but there's a responsibility on us providers to educate our customers, or remind our customers that we are providing security of X and we wouldn't do this, or we would do this, and whatever. But at the same time, there's a responsibility on the customer to pay attention and to know what they're doing, and not go to websites or check that website, or not just trust an email that says, "Here's the instructions, follow them." So I'm not so much concerned on the DoD thing, but this is an overall concern in the entire environment. We need more educated users of technology.
All right, well, before we move on to our next story, let's spend a few moments with our sponsor, Census. Why Census? Our attack surface management tool is designed from the ground up to seamlessly integrate with existing security workflows. It's the only ASM tool that discovers modern cloud-specific assets like storage buckets, and their scanning platforms find more than 85% more services than their nearest competitor. Start with Census at census.io. All right, our next story here results from the first defense industrial base bug bounty. Easy for me to say. Almost 300 security researchers took part in the Defense Industrial Base Vulnerability Disclosure Program pilot, catchy name, over the last 12 months, turning up over 400 valid vulnerabilities. HackerOne ran the pilot in coordination with the Defense Cybercrime Center and Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, looking at 41 entities and 348 systems. May say, hey, 348 systems, that's not inconsiderable. Well, it represents a very small amount of the organizations that directly contract with the Pentagon, estimated on the low end to be about 100,000. The Pentagon hopes to take lessons learned from the pilot to inform a larger funded program. Sean, this ties a little bit into our last story before the break there, but kind of on the other side, vulnerabilities rather than active phishing. We're seeing greater willingness on the part of the Pentagon to essentially open source its vulnerability disclosure program. But under that heading, a good thing never goes unpunished. Do you have any reservations about this type of program?
Not at all. The Pentagon has been doing with in conjunction with HackerOne, they've been doing their bug bounty for their actual systems, for the actual government proprietary systems for quite some time, to great success. And so this hitting what we commonly refer to as the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, all the contractors. This is a great thing, because if we go back to the F-35 breach in 2009, I believe the Chinese was able to compromise a contracting agency to get the plans for the F-35. And so that's part of the DIB. That's what we're talking about here, is the companies that are building stuff or contracting to the government. And so this is, I'm great to see that it's being sponsored. One thing I'm a fan of bug bounties for is the payment goes back to the owners of the problem. So if you think, a lot of times security teams have to, have a budget for application security tools or defense tools or whatever. And if you set up a good bug bounty, what you end up doing is you actually push back that bounty to the developer. And so now they actually get hit with that problem. Maybe they'll slow down and think about the bugs that they're introducing into the environment. And so overall, I'm a fan of bug bounties, and I'm a huge fan of this being applied to some of our national defense sectors.
All right, our next story here, decades old bugs discovered in antivirus software. Researchers have discovered two high severity vulnerabilities in AVAST and AVG antivirus products, which have gone undetected for 10 years. AVAST acquired AVG in 2016. According to Sentinel-1, these vulnerabilities have existed since 2012 and could have affected dozens of millions of users worldwide. So, Sean, these vulnerabilities have been patched, and Sentinel said there's no evidence of active exploitation in the wild. Still, don't insider risk companies offer a deep clean service for legacy vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so you want to watch how you don't get sponsored by someone. I am not getting sponsored by AVAST and the AVG right now. When you sent these headlines, I had to look up that AVAST was still around. I didn't know people were using them. So there's the positive, right? Is it's not a name that's being predominantly used. But that being said, yeah, to me, there's two sides to this. One, decade-old bugs just going left undiscovered, and for various reasons, there's some cleanup and some oh, I trust it. This is the way it's always been attitude, right? This software, this code's always worked. So we don't need to test it. So there's some of that's concerning, but then there's also the M&A process, right? How thorough is the M&As? And right now, it's still very common for M&A to not include cybersecurity assessments as part of the negotiations piece. Whether that would have been discovered or not, who knows? But that's kind of when I first read this, I look at that and kind of go, well, this is something that probably should have been caught through due diligence, but is not. Due diligence doesn't really include cybersecurity to the fullest extent that I think it should, particularly when you're buying companies that are vulnerable and can introduce risk to your company. So it's kind of a combination for me. There's two parts to it to look at it, and I think both of those are valid concerns.
Yeah, and kind of to your point of, hey, Avast is still a company. Like the whole consumer antivirus space has become so consolidated. I think it's like Norton LifeLock, and I don't know, I don't even
Defender.
know. Yeah, basically. And so, like, yeah, when you have that kind of consolidation, yeah, what's the in some degree, what's the motivation, right, to kind of go back through these old code bases when like you own, admittedly, a shrinking market, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, our next story here, CDC purchases phone location data during pandemic. According to newly released documents, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention bought access to location data harvested from tens of millions of phones in the U.S. to track compliance with curfews, visits to K through 12 schools, and compliance with policies in the Navajo Nation. The CDC bought access to 1 year of data from the data broker SafeGraph, who is having a heck of a week. So, Sean, while the CDC used COVID-19 as a reason for purchasing the data, it says it also intended to use it for more general CDC purposes, like monitoring visits to parks, gym, weight management businesses. Curious, what do you think about that?
Well, so the one part that you left off that you gave to me ahead of time that I had to look into was that the particular broker that they bought it from has not, as you said, had a heck of a week, but they've been disbanded from the Android store, et cetera. So there's some issues with the source of their data that you could discuss. Taking that aside, what's the difference between a marketing company buying your data, versus a company or a government that's theoretically supposed to be doing good? So now it's whether or not you have a belief in the government, which we won't get into. That's not what the conversation. Assuming that you have a belief and trust in the government's going to have you in the best interest, I don't see much wrong with this in the sense of my data is probably being purchased by 65 other entities that for some reason want to know where I'm traveling, or not me specifically, but the idea of where movement is happening. And a lot of this I was seeing was starting to come up open sourced, particularly during the COVID. A lot of people were able to pull together a lot of data through open source measures. And so I think buying it gets you theoretically a little bit better quality. And so the reasons why they may be going about it, that's something that might need to be put in check through the standard checks and balances of the U.S. government. So that might need to come into play for the reasons, and maybe there needs to be some legal requirements. I know for us, for the intelligence side and the law enforcement and DOD, there's specific rules we have to play by with regards to U.S. persons' data. So there might need to be some of that regulation, that oversight body that's going to confirm the value or what the purpose of it. But the idea of it, I don't see any wrong with it. They're theoretically trying to help us.
All right, in our last story here, Biden orders new quantum push to ensure encryption isn't cracked by rivals. U.S. President Joe Biden, you may have heard of him, issued two directives on Wednesday this week aimed at quantum computing and its impact on cryptography. The first creates a National Quantum Initiative Advisory Committee, and the second is designed to promote U.S. leadership in quantum computing while mitigating risk to cryptographic systems. The White House statement acknowledged the positive developments that quantum computing can bring, but also issued a stark warning about its capacity to break much of the cryptography currently in use. So, Sean, in your circles, I'm just curious, how much discussion is there about kind of this Y2Q moment and the, kind of seems like it's approaching faster every day when quantum computing might indeed breach through the cryptographic security barrier?
I think this is, I'm not terribly concerned. With every new technology to lock something down, someone's coming up with a technology to break it. No different here. Encryption, decryption, whatever it might be, the speed, we're going to find a way to slow it down. If you're trying to make things complicated, some sort of software is going to find it to make it easier, and vice versa. So I think this is just the inevitability of technology development. We could have said the same about supercomputers 20 years ago, like, oh, supercomputers. And you go back 50, 60 years ago, computers, the idea of computer, the Turing machine, right? We're talking about someone who's breaking manual encryption with a computer. So these are things that are going to happen, and we just have to make sure that we are equal. We're staying parallel to the developments of nefarious activities. We are proportionally proposing secure capabilities. So yes, encryption will be broken. Okay, we'll use quantum to encrypt, and then the quantum won't necessarily decrypt as quickly. So I think it's just those things where we gotta find that right balance. I think Biden's order, I think actually the last three administrations, Obama under the Trump administration and Biden, despite what you think of any one of their politics, I think we've had a very good progress in the U.S. government with supporting cyber warfare, cyber development, technology development, general STEM development across the board. I think there's been some good pushes, and I hope to see more of that from the government, because they kind of have to, some things they have to set as a requirement in order for us to achieve them.
All right, before we get out of here, Sean, any story that was a thumbs up or an eye roller for you today?
Eye roller, kind of the CDC one, because I see that people can kind of throw the conspiracy flag at it. And thumbs up, I think the DOD pen testing or bug bounty stuff, because I'm a big fan of that process and collaboration of the security ecosystem as a whole. I think us as a community have to try to help each other, and through transparency is the best way we're going to do that.
Well, Sean, thank you so much. Sean Bowen, the CISO I totally lost my place here. The CISO with World Fuel Services. Thank you so much for being on the show. Fantastic conversations. Where can people find you if they want to check out more of your stuff? And most importantly, are you hiring?
LinkedIn is probably where I spend the most time, and thanks for putting that up there. And yes, we are absolutely hiring. I was joking with David earlier that two of my leaders have come from contacts we've made through the CISO series as a whole, and we hope to make some more. We are hiring cybersecurity engineers. We're hiring some SOC analysts, and some folks on the GRC team. We're looking for some VM specific people. So definitely hit me up or look for our openings at World Fuel Services.
Fantastic. Of course, we also want to thank our sponsor, Census. Take the guesswork out of your attack surface. Next week, come on back for Super Cyber Friday, where the chat will be on hacking complexity, an hour of critical thinking about how to consolidate and simplify a security program. And of course, we'll be back with another Week in Review show starting, as always, at 3:30 p.m. Eastern, 12:30 Pacific. You can still get your daily news fix, though, through cybersecurity headlines every single day. Give us about six minutes. We'll get you all caught up. Until next week, I'm Rich Straffolino, reminding you to have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOseries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.